The
So,
broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
so you need to, are you sharing your screen? You,
Yep.
all right. All right, take it away, Barb.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our webinar called Parenting Tough Behaviors. My name is Barb Clark and I am a parent support coordinator here at the North American Council on Adoptable Children. I am a parent of 4 teenagers, all who were adopted and are really awesome, fun kids. I've been working here at NACAC since March, helping to kind of organize parent support groups around the country, and have had a lot of experience with dealing with tough behaviors with some of my own children, and am excited to share some of those strategies and ideas with everybody today.
And I'm Kim Stevens and have been at North American Council on Adoptable Children for almost 20 years. I spent 8 years on the board of directors and 10 years working for the organization. I also have 4 adopted children and 2 birth children, and have, as well as Barb, had a bit of experience dealing with tough behaviors, but also, like Barb, just think that my kids are awesome. So, Barb, if you can go to the next screen. We just want to let everybody know, number one, that the webinar is being recorded, so that if you want to come back and listen to it again, if you want to share the webinar with your support group or with other folks that you know, you certainly can. And we had 249 people who registered for this webinar. Um, Usually not everybody can actually be on it, but they will also be able to access the archived webinar later. Just a little bit about the webinar itself. You'll be able to see the slides and you'll be able to hear the presentation either through your computer speakers, or you can switch to the telephone if you're having trouble for some reason. And those options are about halfway down that little sidebar for you. You'll all be muted throughout the presentation. Mostly that's so that background noise doesn't get in the way. And Barb and I are both hopeful that my dog won't be the one that causes the background noise. And we also encourage you to please ask questions throughout. So there's a question log down at the bottom where you can type in any question that you have, and we will try to answer them as they come up, and we'll definitely take some breaks now and again if necessary to answer questions.
All right, thanks, Kim. So with that, we're going to dive right into the tough stuff. And oops. There we go. So we had a lot of fun trying to brainstorm what the tough behaviors are that that often we see in adoptive and foster families. And this is just a list, and I'm pretty sure that all of you guys out there could add more things to it. But some of the kind of consistent things that Kim and I have dealt with our own children, and that we also hear from parents, are things like lying and stealing, raging, cursing, running away, otherwise often called by the system eloping. Hoarding is another common thing, cutting, sexting. Dealing with technology with our young people is one of the most major frustrations that I hear from parents consistently. Substance use, hitting, eating disorders, promiscuity, destroying property, and the list could just go on and on and on. But these are kind of some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Some of them more directly and some of them kind of indirectly. And Kim, that was one that I was supposed to have you do, but sorry about that. I jumped in there. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think that we are good. And the one thing I will just say about this long list of tough behaviors, and one thing that I always try to remind both myself and parents I work with, is that I prefer, and I think it's more accurate to think of these behaviors not as misbehaviors or as troublesome, as much as, for most of them, these are survival skills that our kids have learned to use while they've been in care or before they came into care. And they're really an outcropping of what our kids have experienced and their coping skills that they've come to bear. And if you look at them, a number of them: running, hoarding, cutting, substance abuse, eating disorders, promiscuity, And destroying property, most often I've seen with my kids, they've been destroying their own property. These are all things where essentially who's being hurt is the child themselves. Um, I try to tell folks that don't understand what the behaviors are all about that when you come into foster care or when you have lost your birth family, maybe not even being in foster care, maybe even with a planned adoption, you have really lost power and control over your life. And for many of our kids, the only thing that they feel that they have any power or control over is their physical body, what they do with it and where it goes. And so I think it's helpful to be understanding and compassionate when you think of it more that way than as this is just a kid that's causing trouble.
So true, very true.
So, as I said, you know, kids that have gone through the foster care system, they have a history of trauma, and that is going to have a neurological impact on their behaviors and learning. We know that brain chemistry changes. And again, so this is a response to what they have experienced. It's not a choice to be misbehaving or to be challenging to your parents. We know that kids who have been internationally adopted also have a history of trauma and neglect on top of institutional trauma. And like any kid who is not going to be growing up with their birth family, they have had that primal wound of losing mom, losing dad. Also, for internationally adopted kids, they've lost not just birth family, but they've also lost culture and they've lost language and they've lost a way of being and just sort of a sense of what the world around them is. They've lost their whole world. Children who have been adopted also have high rates of being prenatally exposed to alcohol and drugs, and that again has a significant neurological impact on their behavior and on their learning, as well as makes them much more at risk for substance abuse as they get older. And so the final thing to come away with is to realize that these tough behaviors that we're seeing and that we're trying to help kids learn to control and get a handle on and redirect are a result of a trauma, both inside and outside of the womb.
Yeah, I think some of those points are so important. One of the things that I know NOFAST, the National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome, estimates that 80% of kids that come through foster care have been prenatally exposed to alcohol and likely have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So I think that's something that's really important for parents and workers to keep in mind. And I know a lot of you guys have probably heard of Dr. Bruce Perry or read some of his books and or gone to his trainings, even his one of his books that's really well known is The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. But Dr. Perry was here in Minnesota actually just a week or two ago, but also last fall. And at one of his trainings, he was talking about kind of the three types of trauma that that are common for a lot of kids who've experienced trauma. And he was talking about that there's the intrauterine insult, and so that's a child, a fetus in utero that is being exposed to alcohol and or drugs. It's also just having a mom who's maybe under just really severe loads of stress or is in a domestic violence situation or dealing with things like that. So just that can all change the brain chemistry and the neurons in the brain and all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of our children can be born and the day one in their life outside of the womb already are predisposed to having tough behaviors because of the way that their brain was kind of organized during the 9 months of pregnancy. And then there's also, Dr. Perry was talking about, there's early neglect. So that's often then we have kids who have a mother or are in a situation where the mom is maybe dealing with postpartum depression, or maybe she's in a situation where there's domestic violence or other just really high levels of stress, and she isn't giving the type of attention, nor is the father, if the father is involved, aren't giving the infant the type of attention that an infant needs in those first crucial year or two of life to help their brain to develop properly and at the right speed. And so, and in particular, we see children that are institutionalized and end up in some of the orphanages or things like that early on, and that has an extreme an extreme impact on their brain makeup and their brain chemistry. And then there's kind of the classic trauma that that most of us think about and are aware of, where kids have been abused or neglected or are witnessing abuse. So maybe a child who's witnessing somebody in his family being beat by another family member. Those kind of classic trauma, that's what we generally think of, and often we're not thinking about the intrauterine trauma that can happen, or also the kind of early neglect issues as well. So those are some of the types of trauma that can really impact our kids. And so one of the kind of popular lingos that we use a lot in the adoption community is trauma-informed parenting, and it is just crucial that we, as parents, are trauma-informed, or if we're professionals, that we're making sure that parents are trauma-informed. And so some of the kind of the key important things here that we're looking at is, first of all, recognizing our own history of trauma, or lack thereof. You know, we did a training at our national conference in Nashville August with parent leaders from around the country, and we did the ACEs study, and I can remember a couple of the parents, they're actually feeling so guilty because their ACEs score was 0 or 1 at the highest, and I'm just like, that's something to be happy about. That's not a negative thing, but no matter where we're at, as far as having had a lot of trauma or not, it has an impact on our parenting, and we need to recognize that. Then also that we need to understand the history of our child and kind of where they have come from and what type of trauma they have had. Then it's also important, one of the things that I am constantly reminding parents of is that we have to figure out the developmental age of the child. If a child has experienced any one of those 3 types of trauma, and many of our children have received all 3 of those types of trauma, that has a significant impact on their developmental age and stage, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth here. We also need to grasp a deeper level of anxiety and how that impacts our children on a daily basis, because almost every child who has experienced trauma struggles with anxiety. So we're going to be talking about that. And then we're also going to be talking about moving away from parenting strategies of the past, or the way that we were parented, which that's often how most people parent, is based on kind of how they were parented, and the vast majority of society uses a consequence-based parenting strategy, and generally those are not really effective strategies with our kids. So we're going to be talking about that as well. And then one thing I'm always reminding parents of, we just had a support group last night and I was talking about this, we are all going to make mistakes. We are humans. Even after parents have become more trauma-informed and have learned how to better understand their children, we are going to make mistakes, and it's important then that we're able to figure out how to rectify that and how to move on. So those are what we're going to be touching on here today. And so looking at our own trauma, one of the things that I think is really important is that we do take a look at our own history, our child raising years when we were children, how we were parented, that kind of stuff, and how that actually impacts our parenting. And so ACEs, I think, is something that a lot of us have heard of, but it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it was a national study that was kind of done several years ago. And it's a test that you can actually take, and we put a link here on this screen, and we will be sending out the slides for you guys to access. But there's a lot of different ACEs quizzes out there. The one that we linked is one that we felt was the most adoption-friendly one that we found, and I think it's important for us as parents and even professionals to take this quiz and to see where our number is, to see if it's low, and how that impacts us, and how it is really hard to comprehend what some of our kids have gone through. And then some of us might have higher numbers, and that has a really significant impact on us. Sometimes our kids' behaviors are triggers for our own history of trauma, and it's just crucial that we become aware of that and understand that in our journey as parents and as professionals, also working with these kids who can have tough behaviors.
That is really such an important piece. Many of the folks that are on the webinar, I recognize quite a few names, and I know that some of these folks have heard me present before. My own ACEs score is so high, it's rather silly. Um, so that's a conversation that my husband and I had even going into adoption. Both of us had significant issues in our families of origin growing up, and we really needed to take a look at how that was going to impact us as parents, making sure that we were aware that we might be triggered, also making sure that we were aware that we couldn't. In fact, there was an interesting conversation my husband and I had once, way back early in our parenting career with our adopted kids. We had our birth kids first, but we had a really tough situation, and my husband was getting quite frustrated and said to me, You know, your history in your family is so profound. These guys don't even understand how good they have it. And I just looked at him, and, he's a brilliant guy, but sometimes you don't think of this stuff. I said, You and I made a choice to be the parents. They never made a choice to be in foster care. They never made a choice to be adopted by folks that weren't their mom and dad. And so, regardless of what kind of history I had, they don't need to know that, and they certainly don't need me to compare my history to theirs. What they need is for you and I both to understand how that has impacted us. The other piece, though, I will say about a child's history of trauma, and this proved to be true in my family, and I am certain it has proved to be true in many of your families as well. We don't know our child's full history because kids won't share what happened to them until they're in a place where they know they're going to stay. So we often won't know what their history was until sometimes many years after we've even finalized the adoptions. It's easy to be angry and it's easy to be frustrated with the child welfare professionals that place the kids in our home, but they often don't know. And one of the things that I know happened in our family was that my daughter, one of my daughters who was adopted at 6, who we thought had a sexual abuse history, but it could not be determined. Couldn't couldn't really put our hands on it. There was just behavior that seemed a little out of the norm. And so, like I said, she came to the family at age 6. When she was 18, we were at Disney World and we were in one of those tunnel rides. So you get the Freudian connection there. And at 18, she revealed an extensive sexual abuse history to me while we were on the ride. And I swear it was because at 18, she still had us as her family. So that foster care clock that's always ticking, she finally believed me she wasn't going to have to go anywhere. And she finally felt safe to tell me about that history. So keep that in mind. A lot of times, the kids might not even remember until something happens. So you'll see on the next slide, the other thing that we ask you to do is to take the ACEs test for your child based on your best knowledge, based on what you know and what you can figure out for them. If their number is low, think about how that impacts their behavior, but also think that maybe there's information that you don't know yet. It's very uncommon for a child that has been adopted to have a low adverse childhood experience number. As we said before, even children that are adopted as infants, they have had a primal loss. And if their number is high, you certainly know that that is going to be impacting their behavior. And try to interpret some of those behaviors in a way to try to understand what the survival skill behind it might be. Also, we encourage you to go to the ACEs site and sign up for their newsletters. There's always great information that they're sharing with families and with professionals to try to help make our jobs and our kids' lives just a little bit better.
Absolutely. One of the things that that I am always reminding myself of and talking with families about is that a real, most of us remember middle school, or maybe it was called junior high when you were back in it. It was for me. And it's not a phase of my life that I would ever want to repeat. I thought middle school was horrific. And I think in today's society, it still is a very challenging time. And what I think I see happen a ton of the time to a lot of our kids who have a history of trauma is that the parts of their brain where we kind of have our higher processing skills, our deep thinking, problem solving, decision making, those are generally something that our kids don't have strengths in. And most of our kids are very concrete and very, very black and white in how they see the world and how they process things. And so a lot of them can do okay academically in preschool and early elementary, kindergarten through third grade. The curriculum is pretty concrete. It's your ABCs, your one, two, threes. There's not a lot of test taking other than spelling tests. And so right around fourth grade and each year after that, the curriculum is becoming more abstract. We're trying to get kids to use their problem solving, their decision making. We start to give them these multiple choice tests, which feel like it's trying to trick you, which often I think it is. And they're sitting there and they're having to, to cross things out and to figure it out and think. And for a lot of them, that doesn't work very well, just based on the way that their brain is made up. So all of a sudden, a child that in second grade was pretty successful academically is sitting there 2 years later and have no idea what the teacher is talking about. And so what happens is, for some of our kids, is if they weren't struggling with anxiety in their life beforehand, which many of them were, it starts to come into their life at this point, or it starts to increase if they already were struggling with anxiety. And so they're sitting there in class, they're feeling stupid, and most of our kids would rather look bad than look stupid. And so we can start to see a lot more behaviors start to come out in the school setting, or sometimes they actually hold it together at school, but because they're at such a heightened level of anxiety, when they get home, they just explode and melt down because they just spent 6.5 hours not understanding and being very frustrated. So it's also where we start to see a lot of our kids, that's where bullying starts to pick up around fourth grade, is when it gets heavier, and our kids are really easy targets for bullies. And it's when we can start to see them becoming more socially isolated, because generally their social skills are lacking. That's one of the things that a lot of our kids that come through foster care and adoption struggle with. And so they're starting to feel more lonely, more socially isolated. They're starting to struggle academically, and it's when the fun hormonal changes of puberty start to hit them. So it's kind of this perfect windstorm of three areas. It's like a trifecta that is really, really tough, and we start to see kids just start to slide downhill. It's when a lot of parents start reaching out and crying for help from their county or their state or their agencies and things like that. So it's just really important that we figure out ways to wrap around the child and give them more supports. And this is a point when often we need to look at their IEP or their 504. If they're not on one, maybe this is the time when we need to get them on one. If they're on one, this is the time when we need to beef it up and make sure that we've got some of the important things on there. Like one of the things Kim and I are huge advocates for is like having a no homework clause in the IEP or the 504. It is so crucial that the parents of these children are focusing on attachment and relationships in the home, and not spending 2 hours on what would take somebody else 15 minutes to do. 15-minute packet of worksheets can take 2 to 3 hours for some of our kids and lead to raging, and starts to have this really negative impact on the parent-child relationship. And so we need to make sure that the school stuff is staying at school, and that we're taking care of the home stuff in home, and that it's not crossing over as much as possible.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, my youngest son, frequently I would see him do homework, and then I would get a notice from the teacher that he hadn't turned it in. And it was because he didn't want her to think he was stupid. He would rather have her think that he just wasn't doing his work.
Right.
So one of the things that we touched on a bit was the developmental piece a little bit earlier. And what we know, that development happens in kids in 4 different quadrants: in their physical chronologic age, in their emotional age, in their cognitive age, and in their social age. And I want to share with you an example um, with one of my own children, with my daughter Tanya, um, to let you. Oh, sorry. The no clause. We're going to come back. Pam has a question about the no homework clause. So let me just finish this piece, and then I'll come back to that. And somebody has reported that they have no audio. I'm guessing that you don't have a microphone or speakers maybe on your computer. I would go to the call in. There's an under your audio button on your sidebar. You can pick telephone, and I would use your telephone to do that. So we'll come back to that. So Barb, if you can change to the next slide, just as an example of what this looks like. That's 2 slides. There you go.
Sorry.
So my daughter Tanya, who is now 30, and I will tell you, is texting me rapidly while I'm trying to work little emojis. So that tells you something about her developmental stage. So when Tanya was 15 years old, physically she looked like she was about 20. She absolutely gorgeous, an amazing figure. Um, Socially, though, she was probably around 12 years old still. She was a bit of a social butterfly, although I will say that many of her choices and friends were concerning. And the other thing that was not so much 12-ish was that she would frequently tell us that she had a new best friend. But when we would ask her a bit about that friend, she couldn't say the person's name or anything about them. Cognitively, in school, she was functioning at about a third or a fourth grade level while she was a sophomore in high school. And she was in a special ed class. She was getting lots of supports, had a wonderful, wonderful teacher that was very supportive. But the most significant thing about Tanya is that her early years were filled with neglect, and many of her needs were not met. Tanya was removed from her mother's care at birth. Her older sister was already in care. And in Massachusetts at that time, it was pretty much standard operating procedure that if one child was in care and another child was born, that child came into care as well. So she didn't experience any abuse or neglect in her birth family. She never lived with her birth family, but she was in at least 7 different foster homes between birth and age 6. And when she came to us, it became clear right away that none of her emotional needs had been attended to. And so she was very, very young acting and needed to be treated almost as a 3-year-old. One of the things that she did constantly was that even still at 15 years old, she had a tendency to do that crazy lying that very, very young children do. And it made our relationship terrible because I have a thing about people that lie, and so does my husband. And we would try to get her to tell the truth, even about things that didn't matter. And I was so fortunate to finally come across someone who talked about this developmental quadrant piece with me and said, if your daughter was actually 3, you wouldn't challenge her on these lies. What you're doing is you're making it harder and harder for you two to connect. So if you go to the next screen, Barb. Um, the bottom line was this person told me you need to parent to her emotional age. Parent her as a 3-year-old. Be emotional, be close, be forgiving, be kind as you would with a 3-year-old. And when I took that in and I started treating her that way, it changed everything about our relationship. We went from being antagonistic and at cross purposes all the time, to being close and to being caring and to being forgiving of one another. So when you think about the various developmental stages, what you want to think about is providing your child with safety measures when their physical age or their physical appearance is not quite the same as their age. And that can take a variety of forms. So for Tanya, we wanted to make sure that she wasn't going to be around men that were going to take advantage of her, that are going to think that she's older than she is, that were going to convince her to get her emotional needs met in ways that were very dangerous. But sometimes you have kids that are very small for their age, and sometimes you have kids that are very large for their age, and they can be treated unfairly or unwise based on their size of their body and their development. The social piece, your job as a parent is going to be to provide them with support and guidance around peers. For Tanya, what that meant often was that her friends came to our house. And that way I knew that she was going to be in a safe environment. I knew that there were going to be activities for the kids to do that were age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. And I knew that there was going to be a parent on site that was going to be available. And around the cognitive issues, obviously, what you're going to want to do is be able to be a strong advocate at school regarding that. And with that school piece, I'm going to pass it to you, Barb, because I know you have the
All
next
right.
slide, but I also know that we have a question about how do you get that no homework clause in the IEP? I know some schools are easier to work with than others.
Yeah, often I would say, probably I go to a lot of IEP meetings with families, and I would say 75% of the time the schools, once it's explained to them, the reasons for it, that they understand it. And then, that other 25% of the time they'll maybe put up a fight. But I would have to say every single time that I have pushed for this for myself or for families that I support, we have been successful in getting this. So for some of our kids, it may be some of our kids. There's a few of the kids that I've worked with and their families who actually want them to be able to do some homework, and the kids really feel successful. And so sometimes what I will help a family advocate for is a modified level of homework. And maybe at younger ages, that just means that they're going to do some reading each night. But yet what I still fight for is we're still not going to turn in a reading log, because most of us parents hate those reading logs, to be honest, right? But for the vast majority of our kids, I think they shouldn't be doing homework. And there's a lot of books and research out there. There's a really good book called The Homework Myth that is talking about that homework really isn't as helpful as the educational field seems to think that it is. And really with our kids, if we sit and we talk with an IEP or a 504 team and are talking about and explaining, without divulging too much, but a little bit of the history of where this child has come from, and the fact that in the home front, it is crucial that they're working on forming attachment and a positive relationship. And I actually, with my daughter, it was fifth grade when I sat at an IEP meeting and I said, we're done with homework. I didn't even know that this was an option or a thing that was out there, but the homework had caused so many issues. And I said, I can take pictures if you want, or you guys can come and do a tour of my house and see the 2 holes in my dining room wall and a dent in my fridge that is from homework. And I made it clear we have many other holes and dents in our walls, but those are the 3 that I can directly correlate to homework. And so as I sat and kind of just explained really what was happening from the homework, and I was honest. I said, I end up just giving her the answers so that we can get through it. And so it's not doing any good. And so if we just kind of sit and explain it, most schools will accept that. What I have found too, though, then often as children are getting older and they're getting, in particular in high school, that's when I see the schools try to fight that a little bit more. But even then, we can still make a good case for it. And a lot of states, might have an educational advocacy kind of center. In Minnesota, we've got Pacer is located here. And often parents can get an advocate like that, even on a conference phone call, if they're not able to go to a meeting with them to help advocate for that. So I think and it's also something that I have also had mental health providers or medical providers even write a recommendation to the schools requesting that there's no homework. So there's a lot of ways to kind of fight for that. Do you have any other ideas, Kim? Or
I just remember with Tanya, the same little one, when she was little, at one of her IEP meetings, I just said to the teacher and to the special aide, I can tell you right now, I am never going to do any schoolwork with my daughter at home. My job right now is to just try to help her understand that I am her mom and I'm going to be her mom. And I promise you, I will never ask you to help parent, but I am not going to help teach. At the same time, I said, I will for sure tell her that I have your backs 100%, and that if you're asking her to do some work, that she should be doing it. So you kind of have to feel it out, see what your school system is like, see where you can go. I think Barb's, I was lucky enough that when I said that, I didn't get a lot of pushback, but I think Barb's approach was great.
So this next slide here is looking at kids who have an FASD, and again, not all of the children that we're dealing with do, but a pretty high percentage of these kids, even if they're not diagnosed with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, are, might quite possibly have it. And this slide, I think, is just really, really helpful. This is looking at an 18-year-old. So even if this isn't the age of the child that you're parenting or that you're working with, this is helpful. At 18, they have the expressive language skills of a 20-year-old. So most of our kids have really strong verbal language skills, and actually often you'll hear from other people that they're just meeting for the first time say, oh my gosh, she seems so mature. She seems, they, especially if they've ever heard, like I have this happen all the time when people that I know, and I've talked about some of the stories with my daughter and the challenges we've gone through, and then they'll briefly meet her and then they'll come up to me and be like, well, God, she just seems great. And I'm like, well, first of all, she is great. But second of all, her conversational skills are her strength, and they really are for the vast majority of our kids, and that's why the principals and the teachers and the other people, the professionals, often are really confused by our kids because of that skill. But yet at 18 have the comprehension and the emotional maturity of a 6-year-old. And that kind of really fits Kim's example of her daughter Tanya, who at 15 had the emotional maturity of a 3-year-old. So this is when our kids are graduating high school and supposed to be going off to trade school or college, or even just working out in the labor force. But yet their money and time concepts are of an 8-year-old. Their social skills are of a 7-year-old, and their living skills are at 11. Now, clearly, this doesn't fit to a T every single kid who has an FASD, but really, if you look at that developmental makeup of somebody when they're at the end of their school career, unless they can possibly qualify for transition services from 18 to 21, which hopefully they can, but are they going to be successful out in the world without support? The answer to that is generally no, and that's why so many of our kids that have gone through foster care and this kind of stuff can end up getting into really risky things like sex trafficking or drugs and alcohol and addiction and things like that. So one of the things that we recommend a lot with families that are dealing with kids who have an FASD or likely have one is to take their age and cut it in half. So at 18, we're really dealing overall with maybe a 9 or a 10-year-old. And would we expect a 9 or a 10-year-old to go get a job at the grocery store and get there every day on time and get home every day on time and spend their check appropriately and all that kind of stuff without a lot of supports? We wouldn't. And again, and that's them on a good day. So on a bad day, when their anxiety level is higher, you're dealing developmentally with an even younger child. And so it's just crucial that as parents, when we're seeing some of these tough behaviors, that we are constantly reminding ourselves of what their developmental age is. So this next screen here is something where this is harder to do over a webinar, but I'm going to read this out loud when you guys can read along with me. But it's Last Cerny, Fingaldob, and Pribben were in the nerdling, treppering gloopy caples and gleaming burly greps. Suddenly a ditty strezzle boofed into Fingeldob's tresk. Pribben glaped and glaped. Oh, Fingaldob, he chifed, that ditty strezzle is tuning in your grep. And so you're all wondering what language I'm speaking now, but I have a few questions I'm going to ask you, and you just silently or out loud in front of your computer say, so when did this story take place? So the answer to that is Last Cerny. And then I'm going to ask who the characters are. Well, the two characters are Fingaldob and Pribben, which most of you can see. And then the next question is, what happened to Fingeldob's tresk? And right now you're all saying in unison, a ditty strezzle boofed into it. And then I ask, what did Pribben do? And you guys are all saying he glaped and he glaped. And now my question to you is, what does that story mean? What does that actually mean? And you're all sitting there with your mouths open saying, I have no idea, because you don't understand some of that stuff there. But the point of this really brief activity is for us to understand how our kids comprehend things or don't comprehend. What you guys are able to do is you were able to read that. You were probably able to answer those questions, and especially if I had given you a few more seconds, but we don't have enough time to do that. But you were able to answer the questions and fill in the blanks for me. So let's pretend I'm your teacher, or I'm your probation officer, or I'm your mental health therapist, or I'm the principal, and I'm asking you a bunch of questions. Most of our kids are smart enough and savvy enough by the time they hit a certain age that they can answer the questions that we're asking them over and over or all the time. But a lot of the time they don't actually comprehend it. So often our kids are coming off as more capable and more like they understand more than they actually do. But if you actually break it down and start asking them more questions to get at if they actually understand what last Cerny means, for example, then they would be like, I have no idea. But they're able to figure out what the answer to that question is. So this is just a really important thing for us to keep in mind, that often our kids can answer our questions. And we can say to them, what's the rule about eating after bedtime? You know, and they might tell us what the rule is, but do they truly understand what that means and that kind of stuff? So it's really important that we think about, again, their developmental comprehension and that kind of stuff. All right, so then also you've heard both Kim and I talk briefly about anxiety, and I think it's just I think anxiety would actually be a great webinar to have just on anxiety. Almost all of our children that have come through care struggle with anxiety, and it's important that we actually understand the neurological implications and the physiological implications that anxiety has on our children. And so if we have a child that is struggling with anxiety, that starts to affect them by increasing their body temperature, their heart rate starts to beat more quickly, and all of those physiological things are tied to their brain. So all of a sudden, when they're having that happen, it's kind of for us as adults, like when we're driving along on the highway and all of a sudden we see the flashing lights behind us, and you get that hot flash that goes through your body. You're like, oh nuts, I'm busted, what did I do, or they caught me, or whatever. And then the police officer hopefully goes by you and they're going for another car, and then all of a sudden you have that, oh, that kind of that relief that comes over your body. That's what a lot of our kids, though, that heightened flash of heat that you maybe felt in that moment, that is what our kids are often living in that moment all the time. And that just has such a significant impact on their brain functioning, on their memory. And most of our kids struggle with working memory already. And it's just really important that we think about that, because when we're dealing with tough behaviors, our kids are almost always at an elevated state of anxiety. And when they're at that point, that's when they're more likely to lie, because often they can't even get to what the truth is that we're trying to ask them about, of why they did something. So really taking into account the anxiety is crucial. Anything you want to add to that, Kim?
No, I think you have covered it beautifully. So,
All right.
sanity and insanity. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies because Barb and I are both figuring that's why you guys are on the line. You know a lot about the behaviors. Um, One of the things that is really important to remember is that for our kids, as Barb was saying, their ability to sort of think through in a logical way, the sort of cause and effect, that's not happening for most of them. And so, really, when you're thinking about good attention and bad attention, that's not resonating. Attention is attention is attention. And many of our kids have not had the attention they needed in their developmental years. So, as they're triggering us and touching all of our terrible buttons and making us crazy and laughing about it, and we're thinking, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Well, yes, we are losing our mind, but there's really a reason behind that. It's just a matter of, I need my parent to witness that I am here. And I can't quite figure out that I'd rather have them witness it in a good way than in a bad way. And so our strategy as a parent is really to be able to be the interpreter and to be able to be the person who makes the connection for the child. So touch, any kind of movement. Some of our kids are not okay with touch, so you have to be thinking about that. But really to empathize and to join the child where they are is huge. I can tell you for sure, asking a child why they did something is never going to make you happy. But you can help both them and you figure out strategies and next steps and plan for other things to happen by asking them different questions. What could you have tried instead of punching that kid in the nose? Or the time when, catch them when they've done something right, when they've done something the way that you've wanted them to do it, and ask them to think about what was different this time. How was it that you were able to do such a great job? That's just fabulous. What was different? How can we make sure more of that happens? Or asking them about their feelings. Did you have a funny feeling in your belly? Did you have a funny feeling in your head? Was there something going on that you can describe for me so we can try to figure out how we help you better? We have to use the words to identify their feelings. I found with my kids a lot of the time, I couldn't get them, nor should I have tried to get them to talk about what they were feeling or to explain something that happened. But what I could do was I could identify how I would feel in that same place or in that same situation. So, for example, with a kid that's just raging out of control, first of all, I'm not going to talk to them until they're done raging because they can't process or hear me. But when they're done, instead of saying you were acting, you seemed, what I would do is say, when I'm feeling frustrated or upset, often I don't know what else to do but to scream or to cry. I imagine I would feel really frustrated in that situation. Or talking about their family, their birth family, even, try to put yourself in their shoes. The piece about the rules, I mean, they all go together. The not being rigid, having too many rules, the rules have to be enforceable. I think some of the kids that I've seen that are really having the most trouble out in the world are those kids where mom or dad was saying in sort of a constant way, if you don't, then I will. But the then I will part almost never happened. Um, this idea that you should expect noncompliance and have a plan on how to work with it, I think is fabulous. My youngest son used to jump out of the car or open the car door as it was moving, and we really needed to not have that happen. He was quite small and could get out of the car seat, undo that as well as open the car door. And so I talked it over with my husband. I said, he loves going to get ice cream. The whole family does. We are going to have a conversation with him and let him know that we're going to get ice cream. But before we go, you just need to understand that if you try to get out of your car seat and the car door before the car is stopped, you won't be able to have ice cream, but everybody else is going to have ice cream. We just want you to know that so you can, figure that out for yourself. And we knew that he was going to do exactly what we didn't want him to do and had the contingency plan that, yes, we are going to get ice cream. Everybody in the family is going to sit and have ice cream together. I will stay in the car with him to keep him safe and to listen to him scream. But you know what? He never tried to jump out of the car while we were moving again because he didn't want that to happen a second time. Next slide, Barb. Chores and schoolwork. I think we talked quite a bit about the schoolwork piece. Um, Chores can really be a horrible pain in the neck, but I think making it part of community membership, making chores fun, is a really good idea. And I think also that we do get to change our mind. We get to be flexible. And in one of our demonstrations about how the chore thing and how compliance works, will be kind of a fun review of how that can play out in real time. So we'll go to the next one. And setting limits. Very, very important to let the child know ahead of time what the limits are going to be and even predict with them how they might respond. Talk it over, have an open communication. One of the things that I can tell you that started working out really well for our family is grounding. And I'm going to tell you the way that we did grounding was very different. My husband and I don't like being grounded, and good parents know that you can't ground your child because if you ground your child and you're not grounded too, then they're not really grounded. So that meant we would be stuck at home. So especially as they got older, grounding meant you, teenager, pre-teenager, were now required to do everything with your parents that they were going to want to do. You couldn't bring a friend along, which usually they, if we were going to do a family event, they were all welcome to be friends. But if they were grounded, they couldn't. And you couldn't go to your friends' houses. But that didn't mean, being grounded didn't mean that you had to be miserable. Being grounded meant, for in our family, that they would go to dinner with my husband or I. They would go to the movies with us. They would go for a walk in the park. They would go to the beach. They would go and do whatever it was we felt like doing, they did with us. And it really served a number of purposes. Number one, it meant that we were going to have some good time with them, especially as they got older. They didn't so much want to spend time with us, but they needed to. Number two, it gave us an opportunity to be with them and to not be angry with them. When kids mess up, a lot of times we parents, we hold grudges much more often than we think we do. But if we are doing something fun with our kid that it seems like it has a punishment aspect because they can't have their friends with them. But after a while, it turns into quite an incredible tool. So as our kids got older and we had implemented this way of grounding, when our kids were in situations that they knew they didn't want to be in, or if they were asked to do something they knew they probably shouldn't be doing, they could tell their friends, my mom and dad grounded me, and they could save face in front of their friends because their nasty parents grounded them. But then they still got to enjoy the company of their parents without being uncool because it was now our fault. And we would find that as time went on, our kids would tell us about things they had done wrong and tell us that they needed to be grounded. And usually they told us they needed to be grounded for 2 or 3 months. And we would actually make them be grounded for 1 or 2 weeks, and then we could move on. And then finally, I think it's really important to be, a detective as much as you can be, and figure out truly what is the difference between what your child doesn't do, and does that mean they won't do it or they can't do it? Because there's a big difference between won't and can't.
That's great. I like that. One of the things too that we're always talking with parents about is that one of the most effective strategies is for us as parents and caregivers to change our approach and our response. That's what we control. We can't really control our kids' behaviors, and just based on their neurological makeup, we often have to keep readjusting and changing the way that we're doing things. So Kim and I have a couple of different examples here. One that I have is my daughter, who's 17 now, has been stealing since she was 2 years old and able to walk and talk, basically. And we originally were trying to consequence this out of her for many, many years because we're really slow learners as parents. And it never worked. And finally, as she was getting to kind of that upper elementary age, and I was really starting to understand her brain and her anxiety and all of that kind of stuff, I kind of changed my approach. And we had a deal with her where when I would find something that she had stolen, and cell phones is her favorite thing to steal. She has stolen several dozen cell phones. And so what I would do, what happened in the past is I would walk in the room with the cell phone I had just found in her backpack or in her bedroom, and instantly when she saw me holding that cell phone, her anxiety radar just went through the roof, and she would get really nervous and anxious, and I would be upset, and she would know she was in trouble. And so I finally, when I started to understand that, we changed it up. And what I would do is I would come to her and I would say in a really calm voice, "Honey, who do I need to get this back to?" And she now tells me all the time. I used to spend hours trying to get the story out of her and trying to be a detective, and she would lie. And like one time, one of the cell phones she told me was Justin Bieber's, and I couldn't even get her to understand how that was not a realistic answer, but she really thought that that it could have been. And so once I started to change my approach, and I also had told her, I won't give you a consequence if you tell me right away and if you're able to sit and have a conversation with me about this. So now what happens is she tells me right away, then we sit and we talk about where it was that the item that she took was, and how she was feeling when she saw that item. What were the instant emotions that she had? And then we're able to sit and talk about how she was feeling and what other choices she could have made, and started to give her strategies of, okay, so when you feel that, when you see a cell phone that you want really badly, who's an adult that you can go and find and share that with and talk about it? And so we started to change our approach. Now, she also knows if she doesn't tell us the truth right away, she will have an immediate consequence, like losing her iPod for the rest of the night or something like that. So she almost always tells us now, and I'm happy to report in the last couple of years, her stealing has started to slow down and it is much less frequent than it used to be. So that's just an example of kind of changing our approach and our strategy. When she was younger, I was not going to be the parent of the kid who stole. Another quick example here is one day she would come home from school often and just melt down, and we would have horrible days. And one day I had like worked all day to figure out we are going to have a positive night tonight. It's going to go well. And she came in the door and I was going to bake cookies with her. I had this whole plan, and her right away she says, I want to go to Target and buy a Polly Pocket airplane. And I was just like, what? What? What are you talking about? Oh, what makes you want to? I was trying everything I could do to not say no, but all she was focused on was going and buying an airplane. So I finally said to her, I said all the stuff like, oh, let's put it on your Christmas list or your birthday list, or let's go look up and see how much it is and make a chore chart. None of those things were working. None of those strategies worked. So I finally said, where does Polly Pocket want to go? And she was like, what? And I said, well, she wants to take a trip in an airplane. Where does Polly want to go? And she says, Hawaii. She thought about it for a minute, and I said, oh, and of course we have everything for Polly Pockets, including a limousine with a hot tub in it, but no airplane. So, but I did have a jet ski, so I was trying to tell her lots of people take jet skis to Hawaii. Well, she thought about it a few seconds, but didn't like that idea. Then I went to our toy box. I'm looking, I've got 2 boys, 2 girls. I'm trying to find other planes. Polly Pocket's really little and could fit in any plane pretty much. I couldn't find any planes, but I kept finding boats, but that wasn't going to cut it. So then I'm sitting there and I'm literally starting to sweat, and my own PTSD is coming out because I feel like we're heading towards a rage. And I'm just like, what else can I do? What else can I do to try to, to avoid this rage? So my next idea was, honey, how about you and I sit down here and we will make an airplane out of Legos, and I will do this with you next to you. And so it was like I just kept having to try to think a deeper level of what it would take to kind of get her off of this thing that she was perseverating and stuck on. And eventually we finally were able to work it out. So thinking out of the box and thinking differently instead of just saying no or using the first or second strategy you come up with is really important.
I just want to take a moment to be mindful of the time. It is
Yep.
1 minute to the end. Barb, if you are good with it, I am good to go for another 15 minutes or so that we can finish the whole webinar.
Yep.
And that way, if folks have to sign off, you can always check back in and get the rest of the webinar later. And for folks who can stick with us, you are welcome to do that. Does that work for you, Barb?
That sounds great.
All right. So that would be great. So let's go to the next screen, and I will quickly share another sort of how do you think through these things and understand what your kids are thinking when they seem completely crazy. So the 2 kids of mine that I have talked about, Tanya and Melvin, both used to want to use my car on a regular basis. And I also found, as Barb has talked about, positive consequences are much better than negative consequences, right? So we want to find ways to make the interactions and the exchanges positive. So Tanya came bebopping home from school one day when she was a senior and had a license and had wanted to use my car. And in fact, at that point, we had realized that she was having a terrible time being able to work outside the home, but had lots of needs for us to give her money. And wanted her to learn some responsibility. She was a great house cleaner, and she had been cleaning the house for several months and got paid quite well. She got paid as much as I would have paid a professional because it's an important job. But the house was always a mess within about a day of her cleaning, and she was always complaining that she worked so hard and the house was always a mess. And one day, this day when she came home and asked to use my car, I had realized that the house was always a mess because she left everything in her wake. The mess was being made by her, and yet she was angry with everybody. So um, while she was out at school, I had taken a packet of Post-it notes and I had written the name Tanya on about 35 Post-it notes and placed those Post-it notes all over the house on different things that she had left behind. Because she, again, not great at processing. So she came in the door and fed right into my brilliant plan. And I said, yes, of course you can use the car. I'm busy working anyway, but I'll give you the keys to the car as soon as you take care of a few things. And she said, well, so what do I have to take care of? And by the way, why is my name on everything? Aha! Well, those are all the things that belong to you that have been left behind. And I know you've been concerned about people being disrespectful of the clean house that you have created, but I'm thinking that you're kind of one of the most disrespectful people of your own clean house. So I wanted to help you out. I put a Post-it note on everything that you've left behind. As soon as you pick up all those things that are under the Post-it notes and put them away, you may use the car. And about an hour later, she said to me, I'm all done. Can I have the car? Sure you can, honey. And I continued at my computer, went downstairs about a half an hour after she left, and saw that everything she needed to pick up was picked up. However, all of the Post-it notes were exactly where they had been. And she came home with the car, and I was laughing when she walked in the door. I said, I just have to ask you because I find it fascinating. Can you tell me, are the Post-it notes still there because those are my mess, or are the Post-it notes there so that I'll know where you picked up the stuff that was a mess? And we ended up having a really good laugh about it. She had no idea what the real reason was. She couldn't identify it, but it turned into a moment where we could have some fun. The other piece was Melvin, who really smart kid, but also had a problem with cause and effect. He used to like to steal the car. So Tanya would ask, Melvin would steal. And he stole the car keys one night, and my husband knew that he had. And when he tried to confront him about it, Melvin insisted that he hadn't done it. I was gone that evening. The only people home were Melvin and Buddy and the dogs. And Buddy couldn't convince Melvin that the dogs didn't know how to steal the keys. Later on in the night, while Buddy was supposedly sleeping, Melvin put on entirely black outfit, put the keys in his mouth, and came G.I. Joe crawling through our bedroom to replace the keys where they had been. And when my husband discovered him, he tried to hide his head under the bed like a 2-year-old would do. Mind you, he was 19 at the time. They ended up rolling on the floor laughing because instead of screaming at him and losing his mind, Buddy decided to tickle him. Well, the next morning, Melvin asked me if I could give him a ride to his friend's house. And I said, first of all, I was out all night working. Now I am home in bed sick because I was out all night working. Your father is sick because he was up all night with you. I can't believe it. Are you kidding me? You're asking me to give you a ride? And his answer was, and he was dead serious, he was not trying to be a wise guy. He said, well, I wouldn't ask. I'd drive myself, but I don't know where you hid the keys. Not trying to be a jerk, just that's the way their brains work. It's interesting, and if you can laugh at it, it makes life much easier. I think we've talked about the attention piece. I do think that the slide, the one after that about how to intervene or when to intervene, is really important. I think as parents, we try to fix too many things, oftentimes when we really don't have the patience or even an idea about how to fix it. Sometimes it's okay to just let things go. And Barb, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. My daughter, who is 17, called me a couple of months ago when she was somewhere with a friend and she had something she really needed to tell me. And I said, "Okay, what, honey?" And then she had this really serious voice, which is not normal for her, not a common thing. And she says, "I was somewhere last week and somebody knocked me out." And I said, Okay. And she said, but I'm not comfortable telling you who. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, well, where did this happen? And she said, well, Mom, I was knocked out. How would I know? And I said, okay. And I said, well, and you're not going to tell me who did this? And I could hear her friend next to her sitting there saying things to her. And and my daughter said, no, no, I'm not ready to tell you who did that. And I said, well, honey, if that really happened and somebody knocked you out, that's something that's very serious, and that I'm not okay with that. And if and I really need to step in and help if something like that happened. And I said, but until you can tell me who did this or where this happened at, I can't help you. But I'm really concerned. I mean, I sat and I showed concern, I showed empathy, but I also said, and I said I wanted to help, but I couldn't until I knew more. I basically knew that this story was not true because she has a lie that's a little bit similar to that she tells people all the time. And so she was totally fine. She just, and I think her friend was pressuring her to tell me. I think she was telling this friend, and so basically then the next, so I could have in that moment have called her on that lie and said, honey, this didn't really happen, let's be honest, and kind of gone there. It would have escalated and not gone well. So a few days later, when she was in a good place, I brought this up to her and I said, when you were telling me about how you got knocked out? And she's like, oh, that's not what I meant. And I said, oh, I kind of didn't think it was what you meant. And I said, but, and so we sat and we had a conversation about it and about how it's important that we're truthful and, all this kind of stuff. And she talked about how she had seen something like that on TV. And we had a conversation, and it was a learning conversation, whereas if I had called her on it in the moment, it would have blown up. So that is really important. Another important strategy, and something that is really important as parents that are working with these kids, is that we are flexible. We have to be able to change what we're doing. We have to be able to understand that what often looks like willful disobedience is often just a kid who is dealing with brain differences and that is having a hard time making better choices. And we always say in our adoption community, we got to think about what they it's often not what they won't do, but what they can't do. And sometimes just based on the way that their brain is made up, they really, really can struggle with that. And another thing too is even for parents who are seasoned professionals at using flexible strategies in trauma-informed parenting, we all make mistakes. I still do on a daily basis. And what's really important, I was on the phone last night with a parent until after 10 p.m. who was in a big crisis with their child with a false allegation in the police, and this parent, had said some things to the child that probably were just her acting out in her own moment of fear and anger as a parent. And I was trying to talk with her about, I understand exactly where that came from, but some of those things that you were said are things that are really tough for your child that, has only been with you for half of their life to understand. And it's important that at some point here you're able to talk with her about that and to apologize. And I have to do that with my own children all the time. And I think it shows them that we're human and that we make mistakes. And it's a way for us to actually model that with them. And then again, so a lot of you guys out there might be leading support groups and things like that in your community, and so that's why it's really crucial, whether you're a parent or a professional, that we're able to deal with this and to have ideas when we're leading the support groups. I just led a support group last night, and we were talking about some really tough behaviors, and different parents were going around the table and sharing strategies that they've used in similar situations. And it's also important that we acknowledge sometimes you can use every one of these strategies and be super flexible, and your kid is still going to go down all the way up into the red zone and maybe escalate to a rage and that kind of stuff. And it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. Sometimes they just can't stop that train once it's started. So it's important that we're working on that kind of stuff and nurturing and developing, the emerging leaders so that we can do it. And then it's also important that we're prepared to relinquish the role of leader when we're not up to the task of holding hope for others. Sometimes we're just not in a good place where we shouldn't be doing that, and that's when we need to kind of hand it off to somebody else.
So we have posted up here as well a number of different websites and direct links to some really great resources on this page. And on the next page, some of the books that we have found that have been really helpful. Um, the Lost in School book, I wish I had had it when my kids were younger. Trying differently rather than harder, very, very helpful for kids that are struggling with FASD. Parenting the Adopted Adolescent. I don't know if you folks have read any of Gregory Keck's books. I had the good fortune to know him before he passed away a couple of years ago, and that one in particular really was so fun. And if you're a support group leader, the one Wounded Children Healing Homes is a great one for like a book club support group meeting. Each chapter is written in such a way that you could go ahead and use that as your monthly meeting and to guide the discussion. The one thing that I will say, at least from my perspective, and I think Barb shares this, the bottom line is that as adoptive parents, the one thing that we really need to be able to give our children is unconditional commitment. The thing that they didn't have was that unconditional commitment, whether it was by choice or by someone else's decision, whether it was the government that came in and removed a child from their parents' care, or whether it was that the parent wasn't able to parent that child. Somewhere along the line, each of our adopted children has lost their parent, which is really something that all people would assume is their birthright, to be able to grow up with their parent. And once that happens, for many, many years, for each of our kids, it's kind of like all bets are off. Many punishments don't work because when you've lost the most important thing in your life, losing something else doesn't matter. And I'm sure families on the phone and on the computer have had those experiences where they can't believe that no matter what it is that they try to take away from their children, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter what you try to give to your children. It also doesn't seem to make a difference. But my youngest child would be 25 now. He passed away a few years ago. And my oldest is 43. And I can tell you, the rest are in their 30s. If you can hang in there, if you can demonstrate for your children that you are unconditionally committed to them, you're going to find that it eventually does sink in. It eventually does become real to them. But for most of our kids, that unconditional commitment does not sink in until they're in their late 20s. Their brains are not fully developed until then. Our kids who have suffered trauma, their brains don't fully develop until even later. And the one thing that they need more than anything else is for us to be unconditionally committed to them. So we want to be here, both Barb and I want to be here to help support you in that unconditional commitment. There are a few people that had asked us some questions that I either would need some more information or there's a more in-depth piece. I encourage you to get back in touch with us. We've got our email addresses here, and we'll be happy to talk more in depth with you and offer you whatever we can. And that's my sign off. Barb, I turn it over to you.
Absolutely. We also do want to recognize the Jockey Bean Family Foundation, who supports the work that we do at NACAC through the Community Champions Network, and absolutely, you can feel free to email us questions that we weren't able to answer during this or at any point in the future. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Yes, thanks. Bye-bye.